welcome everyone. So happy to be learning with you again. Today's class is a Hasid in Medieval Garb, Piety and Popular Religion in Ashkenaz and Behind with Dr. Rachel Furst. Just a couple words. If you're joining us, I will send you an invitation to become a panelist. This will mean that you'll be able to show us your smiling face if you wish, but most importantly, it will allow you to unmute yourself and ask questions and answer questions and make comments. So allow you to participate when you want to. Just to kind of keep the class quiet and clear for everyone, we ask that when you're not actively speaking, you keep yourself muted and then simply unmute when you would like to make comments. You can also engage by writing in the chat box here on Zoom or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. Hello to you as well. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you again to those who joined last week and those who are joining this week. What I wanted to do to start off is to just briefly recap with regards to the discussion we had last week, summary for those who were here and a bit of catch up for those who were not, and then move on to today's topic. As I do that, I'm just going to share my screen with you. So bear with me for just one moment. Sorry, hold on one second as I get it up here. Okay.
Is there also something that you would like me to share in the chat?
I think...
Not today.
I think we don't have anything specific for the chat today.
Okay.
Again, just to reiterate, I'm very happy for everyone's participation, so feel free to chime in, to unmute yourself and chime in when you'd like to do so. You're welcome to ask questions and certainly to participate in other ways. Okay, so last week, again, our course is a Hasid in Medieval Garb, as you just heard, Piety and Popular Religion in Ashkenaz and Beyond. And last week we began, our introductory class was devoted to, first of all, a discussion of who were the Hasidei Ashkenaz, these medieval so-called Hasidim. We spoke a little bit about medieval Ashkenaz overall. And then we spoke specifically about this group known as the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. I spoke about an ongoing debate in the academic world as to whether these medieval Hasidim, so-called Hasidim, were in fact an institutionalized, recognizable group of people, sometimes translated in that regard as pietists, right? Pietists, the translation of Hasidei Ashkenaz as the German or Ashkenazi pietists, implies that they were an institutionalized and recognized group of people who existed in the world of medieval German Jewry sometime during the 12th and 13th centuries. We also spoke about how in the academic world, there are those, and particularly this is a growing group over the course of the past several decades, who claim that in fact Hasidei Ashkenaz was not a recognized, institutionalized, distinct group. Some suggest that perhaps at most it constituted a small circle of disciples gathered around the three central figures that we discussed last week, those being first of all, Rabbi Shmuel or Samuel HaChasid, then perhaps the most famous Rabbi Judah HaChasid, his son, and finally Judah's major primary disciple, Elazar ben Judah of Worms. So it's possible that the Hasidei Ashkenaz were just a very small group of disciples around these individuals, maybe a dozen, maybe half a dozen people. Another possibility is that Hasidim in medieval Ashkenaz were not in fact pietists, but rather pious individuals. And the suggestion, the implication is, if we refer to Hasidei Ashkenaz not as the pietists, but rather as the pious of Ashkenaz, is that while we're not talking about an institutionalized, recognizable, distinctive group of people who had a particular set of customs and norms and practices, etc., what we are talking about is a phenomenon, one might say, of piousness, of extreme piousness in certain cases, of behavioral norms and practices that in fact were the domain of a much wider swath, a much wider group of medieval Ashkenazi Jews. That the practices that we have represented in the writings of these three primary figures and a few additional ones are in fact, again, not a program for a distinctive group of people, but representative of broader consensus within Ashkenazi Jewry. And that debate, which is again an academic debate that is ongoing, is going to be one that we're going to return to throughout this course as we attempt ourselves to first put our finger on to define who were these Hasidim, what were their practices, what did they consider to be pious, and how broad, how widespread were these practices, how much did they represent a society at large. So that's again just a recap of some of the basic introduction. In this context last week, we also spoke about what is perhaps the central, the primary source text through which we know about this whole phenomenon of Hasidei Ashkenaz, whoever and whatever they might have been. And that is Sefer Hasidim, again, alternatively translated as the book of the pietists or the book of the pious, depending on how you understand this phenomenon. And again, we are going in our class, we are going to be looking first and foremost at texts from this Sefer Hasidim in order to get a lens onto, in order to get a window into what this phenomenon was and what piety was for these people. We also spoke last week about how the work, Sefer Hasidim, well, again, it's not the only writings, it's not the only lens through which we know about Hasidei Ashkenaz, it is the primary one. It is usually attributed to Rabbi Judah HaChasid, Rabbi Yehuda HaChasid. I mentioned last week, and I'll repeat again today, that this attribution itself is also a matter of debate, as the work presents itself not like, let's say, the Mishneh Torah by Maimonides, which is a very clearly, a text that is very clearly authored by one single individual, but it presents itself a little bit more in a way that's a little bit more akin to, let's say, the Talmud itself, a collective text that probably had a multiplicity of authors, and as a matter of fact, was probably worked on, was added to, was redacted, was kind of edited and re-edited over the course of time by multiple different authors and editors. I'll just add to what we discussed last week, that in fact, the attribution, the distinctive, and to this day, most widely accepted attribution of this text to Yehuda ben Shmuel HaChasid, who was again the movement's, you could say, central figure, is in fact thanks first and foremost to the first print edition of this work. What you see in front of you now, as the caption on the bottom indicates, this is the front piece or the title page of the first print edition of Sefer Hasidim, as you can see here, from Bologna in 1538. I mentioned, by the way, last week that this print edition is considered to be one of the standard editions of Sefer Hasidim, although we have several different, distinct manuscript traditions of Sefer Hasidim that read differently. Some paragraphs overlap, some completely do not. But this is considered to be one of the primary editions or primary versions of Sefer Hasidim. If you take a look at the line that I circled there in red, right in the middle, you can see that the editors or the printers of this first edition, print edition of Sefer Hasidim, to kind of perhaps popularize the book or to work up why this is an important text, why they chose to print it, attributed to the figure of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, Rabbeinu Yehuda Hasid. You can see circled in red over there. Now, by this point in time, by the 16th century, Yehuda Hasid had achieved a sort of cult following, you might say. He had become a popular figure in Yiddish Meisebuche, Yiddish collections of fables and parables from Ashkenaz, from really the eastern regions of Ashkenaz, that kind of turns him into a saintly and renowned figure, probably well above and beyond whoever and whatever he might have been in his own lifetime. And perhaps as a recognition of that saint-like status that he had attained by this point in the lore of Ashkenaz, the printers of this volume attributed it primarily to him. They thought it would be a way to sell these books. And that really has gotten so entrenched in the minds of, that attribution has gotten so entrenched in the minds of hundreds of years of readers. And again, this became a very popular work in its afterlife. Following its early printing, it was printed and reprinted and many, many times, that it really stuck to the point that even today, scholars in general refer to the work as the product of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, even though, also as we discussed last week, Sefer Hasidim it's hard to pinpoint a very clear and consistent position or doctrine or philosophy that Sefer Hasidim promotes. One of the reasons likely is that, in fact, it is, as I mentioned beforehand, the product of multiple authors. That is probably the easiest and most straightforward way to explain why some of its messaging is inconsistent. And we won't go into that too much. I won't go into that further right now, but that's perhaps a point that we'll return to when it becomes relevant to some of the passages that we're going to be looking at. We began last week to take a look at some of the actual writing of Sefer Hasidim. Sefer Hasidim, as we discussed, is comprised of thousands, really, of discrete, distinct paragraphs or entries, most of which are moralistic in tone. It's an ethical work, some of which are halachic in their context, some of which are contain various narrative elements, and much, much more. As we'll see during the course of our studies together, Sefer Hasidim is really a very multifaceted work. And again, those paragraphs were mixed and organized differently in the different versions of Sefer Hasidim, but many of them repeat themselves. Today, our study is going to be focused on the first of the themes that we're going to be delving into in our study of what was piety for these individuals, or what was piety for Ashkenazi society as a whole, and that is the theme of prayer. Now, I want to start off our discussion today by noting that one of the earliest references that we have outside of Sefer Hasidim to some kind of group known as Hasidei Ashkenaz is a passage in Sefer HaTur. Sefer HaTur, otherwise known as the Arba'at Turim, or the 4 columns, was a major halachic compendium that was written, as you can see on the bottom left of your screen, by Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, who again came to be known as Baal HaTurim. He was born in 1269 in Cologne in Germany. He was the son of the famous Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. At around the turn of the 14th century, the family migrated from Germany in light of various political upheavals and other calamities that were going on there at the time, and moved to Spain, where they established themselves and very quickly, although they were emigres, became important, significant Spanish scholars, the Rosh himself, as well as several of his sons, including Jacob ben Asher. Jacob ben Asher, again, his magnum opus, his claim to fame, was the writing of this Sefer Haturim, which aimed to codify all of the usable, workable halachic halakhah of his day. So unlike Maimonides, who had written his earlier code, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher decided to focus on not the esoteric or not the inapplicable laws, the laws of the temple, the laws of the agriculture that were pertinent only in the land of Israel, but rather really on the workable, usable law. Perhaps the lasting contribution of the Sefer Haturim, aside from the fact that it is a text which is studied until today, is that it set the organizational structure that was later picked up by the Shulchan Aruch, which is until today perhaps the definitive code of Jewish law. In any event, for our purposes, what is pertinent is that Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, in his Hilchot Tefillah, in his laws of prayer, makes explicit reference to this group of people who he calls Hasidei Ashkenaz. Now, again, he would have been living in Germany, and he provides this, by the way, this testimony in the name of his brother Yechiel ben Asher. And these men would have been living in late 13th century Germany. So after the lifetime of Elazar ben Judah of Worms, who was the student of Judah Hasid, but nonetheless within the same century of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid himself and Rabbi Elazar ben Judah of Worms, and they refer to this group of Hasidei Ashkenaz. Now, what's particularly relevant for our context is that the context in which the Baal HaTurim refers to Hasidei Ashkenaz has particularly to do with prayer. And I apologize that I do not have a translation of this passage, but let's read it together. In his Hilchot Tefillah, he writes as follows, Lishon Achei Harav Rabbi Yechiel Zal. So this is, I'm quoting in the name of my brother Rabbi Yechiel. Dorshei Reshumot Hem Hasidei Ashkenaz. Those who look after, this is presumably a reference to biblical verses, who are doresh, who explicate biblical verses, those are the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Again, he seems to be referring to a group of people. Asher hayu shoklin v'sofrin mispar minyan tevot hatfilot v'habrachot. They would weigh and count the number of the words and the letters of the prayers and the benedictions, right? So not only would they recite the prayers, but they had this practice of counting up the words and the letters of the prayers. Ukineged manit kinu. And this is again in the context of a discussion in which he's talking about the particular benedictions of the Shmona Esrei, the central prayer, the central silent prayer of all three prayers of the day. Shebegimel brachot harishonot, why were these 18 brachot instituted? Because in the first three brachot, there are kuf zayin, or 107 tevot words. Lefi sheyisodan mizmor habu l'Hashem b'nei elim ubot tzadi aleph tevot umina pasuk ki b'reoto yiladav k'te'ita b'perek bet megillah mara'u lomar bina achar k'tusha Hashem dichtiv ki b'reoto yiladav v'gomer, etc., etc. He goes on and he explains that the numbers, according to the Hasidei Ashkenaz, these different brachot have different numbers of words, and the numbers of words add up. It's a play. This is not exactly gematria, but it's a counting of the precise words of the tefillot. And this is a practice that he associates with the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and he's citing it here as a means of explaining, in the context of his own code, why the first three blessings of the Amidah are recited as such. We don't need to go into the particulars right now. Again, for our purposes, this is important both because it's an outside reference to this group of people called Hasidei Ashkenaz, and specifically it's a reference that associates them and their distinctive practices with prayer and with a particular counting of the words of prayer. And we're going to come back and explain that further as we continue. Now, I do want to note here that the association of Hasidim, or pious people, or piety in general, with distinctive prayer practices did not start with Hasidei Ashkenaz. Those of you who are familiar with the Mishnah and Gemara in Tractate Berachot might already be thinking to yourself, this sounds sort of familiar. You may remember the famous Mishnah at the beginning of chapter 5 of Berachot, which says, Ein omdim lehitpalel el mitoch koved rosh. We only stand, one may only stand and begin to pray from an approach of gravity and submission. Hasidim harishonim hayu shohim sha'achat u'mitpalelim kidei sheyechavnu et libam lamakom. Right, there is a tradition that the early generations of pious men would wait 1 hour in order to reach the solemn frame of mind appropriate for prayer, and only then would they pray. Right, so they had this practice of standing in meditation before they began their prayers. The purpose being so that they would focus their hearts towards their Father in heaven. Right, so really focusing, associating Hasidut, Hasidim, with this practice of focusing, of trying to achieve a very high level of kavanah or intentionality in the recitation, during the recitation of the prayers. The associated passage from the Talmud Bavli that refers to this group of Hasidim Rishonim reads as follows, and this is the Sansino translation. The pious men of old, that's another translation of Hasidim Rishonim, used to wait an hour before they began their prayers. On what is this based? Menahani Mile. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said on the text, happy are they that dwell in their house and dwell in thy house, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha. And you may remember that the continuation of that verse is Od Yihalelu Chasela, right? So those people who dwell in your house, who wait, who dwell, who kind of hang around, only then do they begin to praise the Lord. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi also said, one who says the tefillah should also wait an hour after his prayer. As it says, surely the righteous shall give thanks unto thy name, the upright shall sit in thy presence, right? So these Hasidim Harishonim, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi at least, right, their practice was not only to wait before praying, but also to wait, to meditate, to kind of intensify their kavanah for an hour after prayer as well. It has been taught similarly, there's another Braita which teaches this exact thing. One who says the tefillah should wait an hour before his prayer and an hour after his prayer. Whence do we know that he should wait before his prayer? Because it says, happy are they that dwell in their house, what we said beforehand. Whence after his prayer? Because it says, surely the righteous shall give thanks unto their name. Right, so this Braita basically encapsulates the teaching of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. The Gemara goes on to say, and we're going to just read this one last passage here. Our rabbis taught, there's yet another Beraita which teaches the pious men of old, these Hasidim Harishonim, used to wait for an hour and pray for an hour and then wait for an hour. Oops, excuse me, I didn't mean to skip forward. But seeing that they spend 9 hours a day over prayer, how do we get to 9 hours? Because if each prayer, there are 3 prayers a day, right? Each prayer demands an hour in advance of meditation, an hour of prayer itself, and then an hour following the prayer of meditation, 3 times a day. That's 9 hours a day they spend in prayer. How is their knowledge of Torah preserved, and how is their work done? Right? They spend so much of their day just praying and meditating. How does anything else happen? The answer is that because they are pious, their Torah is preserved and their work is blessed. Okay, that's the Gemara's answer. Not to worry about them. In any event, right, the point that I want to make here is that this association of piety with, first of all, very intense as well as intentional prayer practices and a particular focus on kavanah, on intentionality, on concentration in the context of prayer, that is something that has been associated with Hasidut as far back as Talmudic times. Where then were Hasidei Ashkenaz distinct, right? What about the focus of Hasidei Ashkenaz on prayer is unique to this movement? That's the question that I'd like to pose for us today. In order to begin answering that question, of course, we're going to have to take a look at some of the writings of the Hasidei Ashkenaz themselves. So I want to start off here with this passage from Sefer Hasidim, again, the Parma version of Sefer Hasidim, which teaches as follows. anyone who engages in adjuring the names of angels, or in adjuring the names of spirits, or in murmuring magical incantations, his end will not be good. And he will witness afflictions in his own person and his children for all of his days. Therefore, one should distance himself from doing all of these things. And the passage goes on and on and on. This is an anti-magical practices passage. I will, in parentheses, note the relationship of Hasidei Ashkenaz to magical practices is somewhat unclear. This is yet another one of those topics about which there's not very clear consensus in Sefer Hasidim. But let's leave that aside for the moment, because we're interested in the prayer element here. The second paragraph that you have in front of you says, a person who embarks on a journey should not say, I will adjure the names of angels to protect me, but should instead pray to the Holy One, blessed be he. Several prophets were killed, but they did not adjure the holy name. Rather, they stood in prayer saying, if he does not hear our prayers, we are not worthy of being saved. They relied only on prayer. Right, so I think here, what we have is, again, a sort of a typical passage from Sefer Hasidim, insofar as it really valorizes the action of prayer, the option of prayer, the ability of prayer, the opportunity that prayer provides for the individual to really speak directly with God. And I want to remind you about one of the themes that we discussed last week in trying to, at least as an opening gambit, begin to understand what Hasidut meant for these individuals. We spoke about their focus on trying to achieve Ritzon HaBoreh, the will of the Creator, in trying to draw close to God. And on a basic level, I think we would say that it seems like their intense focus, their valorization of prayer is first and foremost because it provides human beings with the opportunity to speak directly with God, right? Not to call upon angels, not to engage in all kinds of magical practices, right? To just speak and engage directly with God.
Can I ask a question here?
Please do. Yeah.
Is this also perhaps a reaction to the Catholicism of the time in which people use saints? And that's exactly, they use saints to intervene and would ask a saint to guard them on a trip or whatever?
Okay, so I thank you very much for that question, because also, as I mentioned last week, but didn't yet have a chance to address today, the relationship of many of the practices of Hasidei Ashkenaz, and really of Ashkenaz society at large, to contemporaneous Christian practices it's a very fruitful line of research, of thinking, and unquestionably there was contact between these groups, and it seems that in many ways there was interaction, and there were, again, influences is a complicated word in historical circles, but there was certainly interaction and impact between the Jews of the time and the Christians. So what you're pointing out now is that it was a popular medieval practice to make pilgrimages to saints' graves, to venerate the relics of saints. What impact did that have on Hasidei Ashkenaz or on medieval Ashkenazi society at large? Was this perhaps a reaction to that? So I don't want to, again, as I said, there's a lot to be said about Hasidei Ashkenaz and magic. We'll perhaps return to that in one of our later sessions. I don't want to answer that right now without discussing that much more broadly. But certainly, that's, again, the relationship is something to constantly keep in mind, and may well have had an impact here. I will just add to that, that one of the ways in which historians think about the interaction between medieval Jewish society and local Christian societies, as far as Ashkenaz is concerned, is to think about something that is usually termed inward acculturation. What does inward acculturation mean? Sometimes the response on the part of Jews to local practices was to oppose them, to polemicize against them, right? To say we are not like our Christian neighbors. But sometimes the ways in which Jews seem to have done that was in fact to embrace, to adopt, to take in local practices, but to make them their own to the extent that they no longer associated them with Christianity, right? So it was, they took in, inward acculturation means it's not assimilation in the sense that they became like their Christian neighbors, or that they adopted the practices of their Christian neighbors whole scale. They remained very distinctively Jewish, and they thought of their practices and they pitched their practices as very distinctively Jewish. But we, with hindsight, or we as external observers, can see that there was in fact much response to the local practices, and in fact a form of adoption and inward acculturating of those practices. So again, I'm mentioning that as a theme here. I appreciate the question, and yes, let's definitely keep that in mind and come back to that in our summary of this topic and others. I want to take now, so again, so we're focusing now on what was the attitude of Hasidei Ashkenaz to prayer? How did, what was the importance of prayer as far as religious practice, as far as relationship with God, as far as any form of piety was concerned? The next passage that I'd like to take a look at, which is a famous one, it has parallels in various other times and places. And here I really apologize that I do not have a translation. Again, let's read it together. That's why I numbered the lines. It's a narrative, so I think it will be easier to follow along. This passage from the beginning of the Parma version of Sefer Hasidim reads as follows. Adam echad. There's the story told of an individual. Shehaya ro'eh behemot. He was a shepherd. V'lo haya yodeh hitpalel. He did not know how to pray. He was a simple person. V'chol yom haya omer. And every day he would say, Ribono shel olam, Master of the world, galui v'yadua lefanecha. It is well known to you. She'ilu haya lecha behemot. V'notnam li l'shomram. If you had animals and would give them to me to watch over, lakol ani shomer b'sachar, ulecha hayiti shomer b'chinam. Everybody's else's animals I watch for a fee, but your animals, God, I would watch for free. Ki ani ohev otcha, because I love you, God. And the narrator tells us, v'yisraeli haya. He was a Jew, right? I think the implication is a simple Jew. The story goes on, and we're now in line number 2. Once upon a time, one day, there was a Talmid Chacham, there was a scholar walking along his way, and he encountered this shepherd and heard the way that he prayed. Amar lo shoteh, al titpalel kach. And the scholar said, you idiot, don't pray that way. Kach amar haro'eh elav, he'ach hitpalel. But the shepherd said to him, well, how should I pray? What am I supposed to be saying? Miyad limed lo atalmid chacham seder berachot v'kriyat shema v'tfilah al menat shelo yomar od ma shehaya ragil lomar. And immediately this scholar taught him the proper order of blessings and kriyat shema, so that he would no longer have to continue saying, the simple thing that he was saying. But the story continues in line 3. Le'achar shehalach oto talmid chacham. After the scholar continued on his way, shachach kol ma shelimed lo. This simple shepherd forgot everything that he had been taught. V'lo hitpalel. And so he couldn't pray. He didn't pray. V'gam ma shehaya ragil lomar, haya yareh lomar mipnei she'oto tzadik mana mimeno. And even what he used to say, that sort of that simple, direct appeal to God, he no longer said because the scholar had told him it wasn't good. Line 4. Ra'a oto talmid chacham b'chalom halayla, shehayu omrim lo, im lo tomar lo sheyomar ma shu haya ragil lomar, קודם שבאת אליו, ואם לא, תלך. תדע הרעה אשר תמצא אותך, כי גזלת לי אחד מן העולם הבא. This scholar was visited in a dream, and it was said to him in this dream, listen to what happened, right? You better go and tell that shepherd that what he was saying before you ever came was okay. And if you don't go, then very bad thing is going to befall you because you stole from me one from the world to come, right? And I think the implication is that by preventing this simple shepherd from offering his simple prayer, you prevented an individual from attaining the world to come. Line 5, miyad halach. Immediately, this scholar understood his mistake and he went to the shepherd. Ve'amar lo, ma ata mitpalel, what do you pray? Amar lo, lo klum. And the shepherd said to him, nothing. Ki shachachta ma shelimadtani, because I completely forgot everything you taught me. Ve'gam tzivitani shelo lomar im hayu lo behemot. And you also told me not to recite my prayer. If you had your animals, God, I would watch them for free, etc. Amar hachacham, kach ve'kach ba elai bechalom, emor ma shehayita ragil lomar. And the chacham, the scholar said to the shepherd, listen, this is the dream that I had. I want you to continue to go back to praying the way that you used to pray. Line 6. Harei bekan lo Torah velo ma'asim, ela shechashav la'asot tova ve'ela lo ledavar gadol, ki rachmana liba bai, lefikach yachshav adam machshavot tovot la'akadosh baruch hu. Right, from this we learn it's not Torah, it's not good deeds that we're going to merit this man olam haba, rather that he intended to do a good thing. V'rachmana liba bai, famous Talmudic quotation, God wants the heart of people, and therefore a person should think good thoughts for God. And that's the end of this episode in Sefer Hasidim. So I want to ask you, I want to turn this over to you now and ask you, what do we learn? What is the point of this story, as far as you can tell? What does this suggest that the authors of Sefer Hasidim, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, whoever they were, what did they think was the value of prayer? Or what else do you think they were trying to get across in this particular story? And as I said, this story has different, you may be familiar with the modern Hasidic version of this story and various other versions, but this is the one that appears in Sefer Hasidim itself. What do you think they were trying to get across in this passage?
That prayer is the communication with God directly, and recognizing it's not the formal structure of prayer necessarily, but it was the direct communicating in your own way. There are a lot of Hasidic stories that reflect this as well.
Yeah, and when you say Hasidic, I assume you mean the modern Hasidic
Yes,
story,
yes,
right?
the Yitzhak of Berdichev, or
yes,
if they,
yes.
The person comes to daven and it's just playing.
The little blowing on the flute, right? The famous story about the Besht himself. All kinds of variations on this story. And those are, again, when we say those Hasidic stories, we mean the modern Hasidim or the early modern Hasidim of the 18th century, of the 19th century. Here we're talking about a story that appears much, much earlier, but the theme is very similar, right? And I think as if I can just recap what you said, and you can correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but you were suggesting that really one of the main points is, as we saw in the previous passage, prayer is about direct communication with God. The words don't matter so much, right? It doesn't matter that he wasn't saying Kriyat Shema exactly the right way. It doesn't matter that he didn't know any brachot, right? The direct communication with God, that's what counts. Okay, I see other hands up. So please chime in, Emily.
So I guess there were two things that I thought about. One is that the Talmid Chacham also in his dream, he's having a very intimate, kind of direct conversation, or he pictures God as speaking to him very directly and personally, almost reminding him that is what that's what we strive for, that God, that it's okay, it's correct to think of God in that very personal way. And then the other thing that I was thinking about,
if I can just chime in for a moment, right? You're suggesting that the Chacham's dream about God or in communication with God, in fact, reinforced this message of direct communication, direct connection with God.
exactly, yeah, that's, yeah. And then, like almost personal, naive, almost, anyway, but the other thing is that there's sort of a there's a sense of, this, I don't want to say the simple folk, but a folk version of prayer, because by this time, prayer, standardized prayer is well established, but it's an acceptance that there is a folk version of prayer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think if we're saying that, if we're using that terminology even, I'll just add to the things that have been said, that as, again, in accordance with what we said beforehand, it seems to me that this story also really underscores the idea that kavanah is paramount, right? Kavanah, concentration or intentionality or focus on the prayer, right? The heart, the thoughts, that's what really counts much more than the words themselves. Now, again, this passage appears in Sefer Hasidim. We saw the passage, the previous passage, Sefer Hasidim, and this definitely does seem to be one of the messages that the authors of Sefer Hasidim were promoting. However, at the very same time as we have this beautiful story, which again, obviously resonated with many other forms of Hasidim at later times, we also have an unending number of passages in Sefer Hasidim, which suggest, in fact, don't even suggest, and make very clear that these Hasidei Ashkenaz were a bit snobby when it came to prayer. Let's take a look at them, right? And then we can think about the contrast. This passage that you have in front of you is a famous one. Every day, says Sefer Hasidim, a person should choose a place for prayer. If there are two synagogues in town, one of which is closer than the other, and the further one is cultured, that's my translation, the Hebrew is bitarbut, and in the closer one, they stand to pray in an uncultured, meaning a boorish manner, it is better to go to the one further away where they pray correctly. Similarly, if there is only one synagogue in town and it is known that the Jews there stand to pray in an uncultured, again, a boorish manner, and that it is impossible to pray there with concentration, b'chavanah, a person should first pray at home with concentration and then go to the synagogue for the sanctification prayer, meaning Kedusha, which requires a minyan. Now, what does this suggest? The Hasidei Ashkenaz, or at least the authors of Sefer Hasidim, thought about prayer. Does it conform with anything that we've seen up until now? In what ways? And where does it contrast? Please, Ruth.
Okay. All right. So yes, prayer is very important to them, but in this passage, it's form over function, and the other one was function over form. And so after the first story, I was going to say, oh, these Sefer Hasidim, they're not pious, they're pious people. Now with this reading, now these are the pietists, the thinking of.
Okay. So thank you for bringing us back to that debate, that ongoing dispute that that we've been having, or that I've been referencing at least, right? Are we talking about Hasidim, the pietists, or Hasidim, the pious, right? So whereas the previous story, exactly, I think as you said very nicely, seems to suggest that we're talking just about, these pious, even simple pious people or people who valorize simple piety. This one is already, as I said, starting to sound a little bit snobby, starting to sound more like the pietists, right? There is the form, as you said, matters more than the function. Now, I will point out here that the kavanah is still front and center, right? The reason to choose one synagogue over another, at least according to the second part of the passage, is because in one synagogue, it's possible to pray with kavanah, and in one, it is not, right? And if it's not, now, I will note here, right, that prayer, and again, this maybe emphasizes more of the form over the function, there's a value to praying in society. There's a value to praying in community, right? One needs a minyan, one needs a community in order to recite certain basic prayers, right? The Kedusha, for example. And so therefore, at no point is the author of this text advocating staying away from the synagogue altogether. It's just that the synagogue starts to sound like a place where real prayer doesn't really happen sometimes, right? If the real prayer is this direct communication from God, and here I want to suggest there is a connective tissue between this passage and the previous ones that we saw, right? If real prayer is about kavanah, is about direct communication with God, then real prayer might happen outside of the synagogue. It's still important to go to the synagogue, right? It's critical to be able to say certain parts of the prayer in community with a minyan, but the real prayer happens beforehand at home, right? Now, some people have suggested that these theoretical two synagogues in town, which, by the way, many communities, Medival Ashkenaz, could not have had two synagogues. They were oftentimes very tiny little communities that could barely sustain a single minyan. But nonetheless, some have suggested that these two synagogues reflected two different subgroups within medieval Ashkenazi society. One was the synagogue of the pietists, one was the synagogue of the non-pietists. If a pietist lived on the far end of town, surrounded by all of his non-pietist neighbors, he had to make a trek all the way across town to daven with the pietists. But again, if we say that this distinct cultural group of Hasidei Ashkenaz never really existed, then there's a message here that goes beyond anything that might have been reality. I want to take a look at the next passage, which takes this one step further. This is an extremely yeah, please.
Could I just ask about the translation of tarbut?
Sure.
Rather than calling it cultured, I would use the translation proper. In other words,
proper is another word that we could,
even present.
Yeah, I think when I was using cultured, I was thinking
Germanic kind of style versus a more loose and let it fly kind, that there was this concept of it being and actually that might fit the German style.
Okay, accepted. And again, once you're already pointing that out, I do want to underscore the fact that, again, according to this passage here, right, these Hasidim, or at least the author of this text, did have an idea of prayer following a very particular form, right? It had to be proper. What did proper mean, right? It could mean that it wasn't, a free-for-all the way maybe he felt was going on in some of the other synagogues that he did not like, but that there was a proper form. It wasn't only, right, about the heart. So there's, again, a tension here between these themes. I want to move on to this next passage, which I think takes this, as I said, one step further. Here, the author writes, in one town, there were two synagogues. Again, similar idea. When a sage would come to town, sometimes he would go to one synagogue, and at other times he would go to the other. Eventually, he prayed only in the small one. People asked him, why did you stop going to the big one? It has many important people in it. He said to them, in the big synagogue, they rush through the blessings and the psalms and frequently prevent the prayers from being said at the right time. That does not happen in the small synagogue. There, they say the blessings and the prayers of praise slowly. And I earn reward, right? And I want to point out the Hebrew is ve'ani marviach le'akadosh baruch hu. I earn reward for the sake of the Holy One, but some suggest that marviach is actually means something like enlarge or expand for the sake of the Holy One. When I say the prayers slowly, What does that mean? That I earn reward or that I enlarge the name of God? Well, when I say the prayers slowly, I count on my fingers how many alifs, how many bets, how many of each and every letter there are in that particular psalm. Afterwards, I go home and I supply reasons why it is so. Now, think back to that passage that we saw from the tour and that sort of bizarre counting up of letters in the verse in the blessings of the Amidah that he was referencing. And here is another reference to that peculiar practice associated very strongly with the Hasidei Ashkenaz, right? According to this, what this passage suggests is that this kavanah or intentionality that the Hasidim of Ashkenaz embraced was not, sort of open-ended meditation, but that it took on a very particular form in practice, that they would attempt to achieve this intentionality by really focusing in on the very, very smallest building blocks of the prayer, by counting up letters and counting up not only words, but even the letters of the individual prayers. Right? And there's a second step to it here, because according to this scholar, at least, right, it wasn't just a random counting, like, deep breaths in and out, right, for the sake of maybe, focusing your mind, but there was a purpose to it, because when he went home, then he would count up all of these words and letters, and he would come up with reasons and explanations, a deeper meaning to the prayers themselves. Now, this the suggestion in various other passages in Sefer Hasidim and external sources is that, as you can imagine, to whatever extent this practice really was adopted by certain individuals in the Ashkenazi community, probably generated a certain amount of tension within the community, right? You can imagine that this scholar who likes praying very slowly, so slowly that he can count up the words and the letters of the prayer, right? Probably not going to be beloved by all members of the community. And there are various suggestions throughout Sefer Hasidim that in fact this was a source of tension. Now, again, I will remind you that whether the tension actually existed or whether the tension was in the mind of the authors who wrote this book is, again, an open question that we'll have to keep returning to. But to take that one yet another step further, I want to look at this. This is going to be one of our final passages for today, which makes reference to a much wider spread medieval Ashkenazi prayer practice that goes well beyond these Hasidei Ashkenaz themselves, and that is, it pertains to the recitation of piyutim. Now, piyutim as poems, elaborate poems that became part of the prayer service, particularly on holidays and special occasions. That was not something that was initiated by the community of medieval Ashkenaz. It existed already in ancient times. Many of the piyutim that we recite until today were authored by the Kalir, who was a poet from the ancient world. But nonetheless, this was a practice that was particularly embraced by the medieval Ashkenazi community. Many piyutim were authored in medieval Ashkenaz, very elaborate, very difficult to interpret sort of piyutim. And they, again, many of the machzorim from medieval Ashkenaz are replete with these very elaborate piyutim. Hasidei Ashkenaz were one of the promoters of the recitation of piyutim. As a matter of fact, Elazar ben Judah of Worms was the author of many of the piyutim that we have until today. But nonetheless, they, as we'll see from this passage, there was a bit of friction pertaining to the local piyutim customs between, again, at least the authors of Sefer Hasidim and what they perceived to be the standard norm. There are piyutim to which the following biblical verses may be appropriately applied if they are recited. Now, you can just read the verse and you get the point. She has lifted up her voice against me, and therefore I hate her, said Jeremiah. Your mediators have transgressed against me, said Isaiah. Right? So some piyutim, that's the way we should respond to them. Even piyutim written by the righteous right? So clearly that's the way that we should relate to piyutim who are written by bad people. And we'll have to talk on another occasion about what bad people were for the authors of Sefer Hasidim. But even piyutim who are written by righteous individuals, if they were recited by a bad man. As a matter of fact, should there be a scholar, an expert in the law, and he composes piyutim and he hurries the blessings and the psalms of the morning prayer in that synagogue in order to be able to recite his piyutim, it's improper to recite his piyutim. For what David composed by divine inspiration, he scorns and hastens to cast out from his mouth, while that which he composed, he recites slowly. Right, so what's the problem here with this scholar, righteous individual, wrote beautiful inspired piyutim? Well, he rushes through the regular prayers, he rushes through all the mizmorei tehillim that he can get to recite his poems. That's a problem, right, for the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Similarly, if a scholar does not give charity or do personal favors, or if he's a scholar and is also quarrelsome or proud, it is improper to recite his piyutim. There's a lot that can be said here, but because our time is almost up, I just want to suggest, in accordance with what we've said thus far, that this is picking up on many of the previous themes, right? This idea, first of all, that prayer is to be recited slowly. The primary prayers, the main prayers, are to be recited slowly with intentionality, right? Rushing through the regular mizmorei tehillim that you can get to, the fancy new piyut that you composed is anathema to the authors of Sefer Hasidim. And similarly, kavanah, intention, right? Intention of the person writing the piyutim, intention of the person reciting the piyutim is critical to their effectiveness as prayer. I'm going to skip over this passage right here. We'll come back to it perhaps on another occasion, but I do want to point out this illustration very briefly, where you can see the prayer leader. This is from the very famous Leipzig Machzor, which was put together in around the year 1300, about 1310. You can see the prayer leader reading from a book. Many of the prayers in medieval Ashkenaz, incidentally, were recited orally by the congregation, and we'll return to that theme. Another point that I want to make here that we're going to be returning to is I want you to note that this prayer leader is wearing a very distinctive prayer shawl with long tzitziot hanging down, right? We're going to come back to that because, as I mentioned last week, we're going to be talking about the importance of dress to the authors of Sefer Hasidim, to the Hasidei Ashkenaz. But what we have here, and this is a sort of very typical scene that we see in many machzorim and other illuminated texts from medieval Ashkenaz, where prayer was not only the provenance of the authors of Sefer Hasidim, it was not only important to the pietists or the pious ones of Ashkenaz, as in the Hasidei Ashkenaz, but we know was in fact a much more broadly embraced critical practice, really significant practice to the Ashkenazi community as a whole. And so I'm going to I want to pull together some of the things that we said today by once again posing the question that I posed last week, which is, to what extent are these practices, even the idiosyncratic ones among them, the distinct preserve of a group called Hasidei Ashkenaz? And to what extent do these ideas about prayer, intentionality, form versus function, direct communication with God, reflect a much broader consensus among the medieval Ashkenazi population as to what constituted piety? And if you'll give me like an extra 2 minutes, I want to conclude our discussion today with a text that we are most certainly going to be returning to, and that is a very famous elegy being a prayer for the dead, a poem for the dead, that was composed by Elazar ben Yehuda Rokeach HaVorm. So by this, one of the central figures of the supposed Hasidei Ashkenaz movement, after a very tragic incident in which his wife and 2 daughters, his home was attacked by, not exactly clear, Christian something, And his wife and 2 daughters were killed right in front of his eyes. Again, we're going to be returning to the story. We're going to be returning to these figures. So I just want to take a look at a couple of lines of this poem, this kina that he composed after their deaths. It's a beautiful and extremely moving kina, which plays off of the biblical Eshet Chayil. Right? He takes the various passages from Eshet Chayil and sort of explicates them in accordance with what he saw as being his wife's outstanding characteristics. So he begins, what a rare find, Eshet Chayil mi yimtza, what a rare find is a capable wife. Such a one was my saintly wife, Mistress Dulce. Her lamp never, and I'm skipping down to Lo yichbeh balayla nera, his explication on that part of Eshet Chayil. Her lamp never went out at night. Well, she prepared wicks for the synagogue and the study rooms, and she said psalms. She said hymns and prayer and recited supplications. Every day she extended her hands to say the prayers beginning Nishmat Kol Chai and V'chol Ma'aminim. She invoked Pitum HaKtoret and the 10 Commandments. In all the cities she taught women, enabling their pleasant intoning of songs. She knew the order of morning and evening prayer. She came early to synagogue and stayed late. She stood throughout the Day of Atonement and chanted, and the poem goes on and on. Now, on the one hand, this Dulce was the wife of an individual who is among the most closely associated people with the supposed Hasidei Ashkenaz movement, right? Was she a Hasidah, as in a pietist? Well, maybe. If any woman was a Hasidah, she certainly would have been a good candidate. But in fact, when we read this poem and we read various other parts of testimony that we have about her activities in her life, much of what is being described here could, according to other writings and testimonies that we have, be accurately used to describe quite a number of men and women in medieval Ashkenazi society. These activities of being very present in the synagogue, of going regularly to tefillot, right, might sound surprising, and we're going to be talking, as I mentioned last week, about gender in Sefer Hasidim, so we will certainly return to this. But that presence in the synagogue, that engagement on a regular basis with prayer and with communal prayer, and within all of these various activities surrounding prayer, that is something that all testimony that we have from medieval Ashkenaz suggests was in fact the provenance, as I said, of a very wide group of medieval Ashkenazi Jews, not only this sort of tiny little circle of people that we might call pietists. And so once again, I want to leave you with this question: to what extent are these attitudes toward prayer a pietist phenomenon? And to what extent do they represent an approach to religiosity, to piety, that was much broader? And I apologize for the extra couple of minutes, but I will conclude here. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. Of course, anybody who needs to go is more than welcome.
Okay, we can take a question or two. Feel free to unmute. Anyone has any questions? All right. Thank you
Okay, so keep thinking about it, please, and we'll continue with that next week. I'll be happy to pick up on these themes and to answer any questions that might occur.
What does it mean that she extended her hands to say prayers?
That she every day she extended her hands. So that in the Hebrew it's v'yadeh b'chol yom l'nishmat kol chai v'chol ma'aminim. That's a good question. It probably means that she was engaged in sort of in physical movements and motions in the course of the prayers, right? Again, we'll come back. We're going to come back to this poem. So I promise we're going to look at it more carefully. What I want to point out is that it might be related to the fact that she is referred to as a sort of a prayer leader of the women, right? She teaches the women how to recite the prayers. She leads the women in prayer. And that might explain what she was doing, sort of extending her hands and making these motions, is that she was physically engaged in the act of prayer as a prayer leader. And you can, I'll perhaps leave you again. Here's yet another image of an individual in the midst of the synagogue, but the one that we saw beforehand, right? It's sort of notable that the individuals in this, both the prayer leader and the man behind him, also have their hands raised in supplication, in prayer, in these images from the medieval Ashkenazi Machzorim. So maybe that is an image to keep in mind as we think about Dulce and her activities as well.
Right. Also, a key just could be paraphrasing Eshet Chayil, Shilcha Yadeha Bakishor.
Yeah. That also might be, it might be just picking up on the language of Eshet Chayil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you so much for everyone who joined us today and is part of our learning community. Looking forward to seeing you next week at the same time. We have many other classes happening in this month, so please check out our website at darisha.org. And the recordings are available as well, the recordings of the classes. And yeah, for now, lehitraot.
Bye-bye.